What's going on in the world? That seems to be what everybody is asking today. When you go out in public, people are wearing face masks, they're wearing gloves, they're hand sanitizing everything after they touch every single thing. It doesn't matter if they spray Lysol on a package of eggs. When they handle that package of eggs, they put hand sanitizer in their hands and rub them together. And then when they get home, they're washing groceries. Everywhere we turn, it seems like everybody is talking about what is going on in the world. And that's exactly what happened in one of the post-resurrection accounts from the Gospel of Luke. 2 disciples left the 11 in Jerusalem after Jesus had been crucified. They couldn't travel on the Sabbath. So the first day of the week, which is a Sunday, they leave to go back to a village called Emmaus. But before they leave, they hear the women that had just come from the tomb of Jesus reporting that he wasn't there and seeing visions of angels. And then Luke writes that the disciples and their companions thought these women were beside themselves. Maybe they had some type of post-traumatic stress imagination or visions to help them cope with their grief, but surely Jesus couldn't really have been risen from the dead. And so then Peter and John rush to the tomb. One stops and looks in, and one goes in, and they find the tomb empty, but even still, they don't know what's happening. Until 2 disciples leave, possibly giving up hope from everything that had happened. Jesus, that they thought was going to restore the kingdom. In fact, on their way, on the road back to Emmaus or wherever they had come from, wherever they had left to follow Jesus, they start talking about all the happenings, and all of a sudden this lone traveler shows up and begins to walk with them and asks them, "What are you talking about?" And almost taken aback, they ask him, "Are you the only one who doesn't know what's happening?" And they retell the story of Jesus, how that they had hoped that he would be the one to restore the kingdom of Israel. They had hoped, and yet their hope was met with much disappointment. And then they tell them that some women had reported some strange stories. And all of a sudden, this person, who the scripture says is Jesus, but was hidden from their sight, begins to retell them all of their history, going back to Moses, to the book of Genesis, and shares with them and points them to the law, to the prophets, to the Psalms, how the Messiah that they were expecting was supposed to meet great suffering. And Jesus is getting ready to go on. He walks with them 7 miles to Emmaus and is ready to go past and further with them. And they stop him and encourage him to come sit down and to eat with him. And while they're talking, Jesus takes the bread and he blesses it and he breaks it and he gives it to them. And they recognize that it is Jesus. This stranger breaks the bread the same way that Jesus does. And instantly he disappears. He leaves them. And that same hour, they stand up, leave their house, and go back to Jerusalem and tell the disciples and their companions what just happened. And yet those in the room who still haven't seen Jesus don't believe him. And all of a sudden, in their midst, Jesus appears. And he rebukes them for their doubt and their unbelief. And he asks them to see his hands and to see his side. Here's the interesting thing, is that Jesus walked with them. Even though they were doubting, he helped them. Even though they may have been disappointed, he met them along the road where they were. And he reminded them that everything that had happened up to that point that was so disappointing and disorienting was part of God's plan. So let me ask you this. on the journey you're on, where is Jesus? Because chances are, he might be right there with you, but you just might not recognize it. They heard Jesus' voice before, but this time they didn't recognize it. They had seen Jesus before, but this time they didn't recognize him. It's completely possible that with all the disappointment that we're facing, however that may look, that Jesus is right there speaking to us, but we just don't recognize the voice. Now, here's the encouraging thing, is that Jesus pointed to the scriptures. He pointed to all the promises of God in the Old Testament that spoke of the Messiah, the one who was supposed to fulfill all of their hopes as being someone who would have to undergo much suffering. We have this promise now. We have scriptures, the New Testament, that were written by those who had seen Jesus after the resurrection. And they tell us something, that our sufferings, our disappointments now, are ones that we share with Christ. And if our disappointments now, if our hope that's been lost now can be identified with that of Jesus's, then all of them are going to be met. Hope is not something that is felt. That's wishful thinking. Hope is not something that's imagined. That's dreaming. Hope is something that we hold on to that causes us not to give up no matter how difficult it gets. So this is my prayer for you, that the God of all hope, the God that foresaw all things, allowed all things to happen, and not only that, but meets us on the road of disappointment, is still walking with us, and that would cause us not to give up. May the Lord bless you, may the Lord keep you, and may he make his face to shine upon you. God bless you, Crossroads.